Hello, everybody. So, disability rights are something that often are overlooked in social justice movements. And it's something, as I was preparing the syllabus, that I was thinking about how do we interrogate ableness and what role does that play in really structuring inequality? So, as we're thinking about, I found it of most importance to really highlight this for this week. And again, I wish that we were in class and engaged in this topic because this is of such importance and something that is really, really overlooked. And I think that's what our author, Mladenoff, makes very clear. And when we're thinking about social justice, how disability and the rights that are attributed to those folks who um, are left on the margins are really negated and overlooked, made invisible. So I really want us to really think deeply about any movement that and I hope maybe some of you are writing papers on disability rights or engaged in any of these movements. Because as we see in this reading, it is fundamental to all rights and how we're thinking about justice. So I just want to provide a brief overview. You have the slides, the PowerPoint, which are really just reiterating what the article is stating, but wanted to have a conversation with you, at least in this virtual world, and again, invite you all to jump in on student hours and we can have a conversation about this. Okay, so this is a framework of disability for social justice. So what Mladenoff is stating is that society is just only when it provides accessible and disability support. 2, it is just only when it does not stigmatize disabled people's dependency. So that's key, dependency. And 3, a society is just only when it is possible for people impaired by global economy and violence to have a say in policies that have affected them. Justice. This is the title of the course, social justice. What is justice? And I want us to really reflect deeply on this term. People claim we want social justice, we want racial justice, we want economic justice. What are we talking about? What is justice as a universal claim? And how is justice, and this is something Mladenoff makes clear in this article, how is justice even contained within the territory of a particular nation state? And if we contain it, the meanings that we attribute to that word justice or how it's applied, then it becomes an injustice, right? In this era of globalization, Mladenoff is pointing out clearly that justice cannot be contained. And he builds on the theory of Nancy Fraser. And Nancy Fraser provides a very important view and makes clear how when we limit justice to a particular territory on how we're going to define it and how we're going to apply it, then it becomes unjust, right? So we even have a system of criminal justice. How is that defined, right? That would be the opposite of the justice that we're trying to achieve in social justice and movements that are on the move out there in society as we speak. So Nancy Fraser's theory of social justice is focused on 3 attributes, right? So 1 is redistribution. Think of the economy. How can we achieve, just a minute, I was just trying to reach for Nancy Fraser's book here that I remember we read through, and it was very important for me in thinking about how to think about justice beyond the bounds of the territory, and how can we achieve justice even in a capitalist society, where in a capitalist society it is inherent that you have structured inequalities. That is fundamental and necessary, right? You have to have those who work for low wages, those who work for mid-range wages, and those who are the executors of the workers, or maybe the executive class, the professional class, and so on, and then those who own them and their labor. So Nancy Fraser says we have to think about redistribution in a fundamental way that will require deep structural changes. And for these, it would require a different type of a system other than capitalism. So recognition, cultural. There has to be cultural recognition of those particular folks who have no power or little power, right? Meaning in those institutions. So it's not limited by this diversity, multiculturalism, those symbolic forms where we celebrate certain holidays, or you have certain months for particular racial groups or people or genders or um, or other populations who are not front and center as part of the nation state. So it also encompasses a sort of deep restructuring of the symbolic order that is associated with deconstruction. So in other words, what I'm stating, power relations, though we have to analyze and deconstruct those power relations that are made by these cultural differences. So in our nation state, in the United States, there is a belief that we are a multicultural society, a pluralist society. We recognize group differences, and it's nice to eat all these different foods, but there is no power behind the groups that are producing those things other than whoever is at the top of the racial hierarchy, right? So even to recognize that other lives matter beyond the velours of whiteness that are ingrained in every institutional aspect of U.S. society, and our Constitution, to citizenship, to how it's being contested on the streets today, this has to be reformed in order to even move towards any semblance of justice. And the political, the third. So representation. So which requires transformative strategies of political representation which seek to democratize decision-making on a transnational basis. So transnational is the key, right? Recognizing that the principle of the nation-state is out of sync with the structural causes of many injustices in a globalizing world which are not territorial in nature. So we first need to identify and situate democracy on a broader scale, not just within the territory of the nation state, or we see actual crises at our southern border, and yet we're told by certain powers that they are not part of us. They are not part of our polity or our nationalist image, but yet we rely on certain things that are occurring within this economic form of globalization. So democracy has to be rooted in that reality that we operate outside of the territory, and therefore it must be transnationalized, move across borders. So justice as a universal, if we're thinking not only to our particular place, our territory, but as a universe, as the whole world, as it may be, because we're all interlinked, right? So now, how can disability rights really fundamentally help us think about social justice in those ways? And Paladov points to things that, and the one overlook that, it should be 1, 2, 3, right? But he points to these three things: the decommodification of labor. This is where disability rights and the category of disability can help us think about the deconstruction of self-sufficiency, right? So when we're thinking about the decommodification of labor, we're thinking about labor exploitation and the way that it becomes a commodity as we move from the human subject to a commodity, because we begin to produce things in exchange for a wage, right? An hourly wage, a salary wage, and how does that labor become commodified? And it enters into this global capitalist economic system. We need to deconstruct self-sufficiency, right? That idea that I am personal responsibility driven by capitalist logic, right? That states that we must be workers first, that we must not sleep, that we must exercise and produce and our labor in exchange for some value that whatever the employer seeks. And that last point that I was speaking of, the transnationalization of democracy, right? How can we broaden and actualize democracy in a way? And in this article and some of the questions that I posed for you in the discussion post are thinking about how what Mladenoff is pointing, how disability rights can really help us see. So this is a category, as I began to think about and state at the outset, those who are disabled, the world was constructed by those who were able-bodied. And they created a world, whether it's a classroom, whether it's a college, for able-bodied persons. Right? So how did that erasure at the outset begin to structure inequality for those who are disabled? And how does the state and the polity treat them? Right? So in comes those people who have resisted, who have led to certain gains here in the United States. We're reading this from a European perspective. If you've noticed, which was intentional, to think outside of the United States and to think beyond, but also to highlight how disability rights are the world over, and how disability is, it wasn't until the 1990s till you get a Disability Rights Act in the United States. People had to protest, go on the move in the streets to create some change. So when we're thinking about economic redistribution, so gender, and this is from the text, coding gender and disability, when we're coding of an activity as feminine, it legitimates its exploitative incorporation into the system of capital accumulation. So now we begin to intersect certain different categories and on the way that labor and the levels of exploitation are structured depending on how these categories are applied. So even if a male is doing, someone who self-identifies as a male, but does feminine type work, gets paid less, right? That's just an example there. So disability is a major instrument used by the capital state to regulate the supply of labor in the interest of capital accumulation. So if gender, class, and race is key for division of labor, disability is key for commodification of labor. And it also is going to be key on how to move away from that, right? So you need access to build in support, not where one has to think about, even if I am disabled, how can I contribute to this capitalist society and take me away from my life that I'm living, but how can I produce and work for a wage? We need to deconstruct that, right? So you need to create institutional support for that. So disability and cultural recognition. And this is where I was pointing to that notion of self-sufficiency. Capitalism generates misrecognition by promoting self-sufficiency. So it is capitalism itself, that system that Mladenoff is pointing to, that really takes us away from the idea of being human, of having time to think, to reflect, to live, to actualize, but rather now it is this system that says, no, the onus is on you, the individual. Even if you carry this disability, how can you contribute to capital accumulation for whoever owns the means of production? So the human and in this idea of capitalism, the idea of the human subject is, quote, the rational utility maximizer who is free from social and natural restraints or external interferences. And in the era of neoliberal capitalism, one is sleepless, tireless, hyper-able, flexible, mobile, and continuously enhancing one's capacity to produce and consume. Production and consumption. That is the subject in this neoliberal age. So we actually need to expose that, and we're moving through to political representation. So misrepresentation is generated by keeping democracy national in a capital system that is transnational. So that contradiction, we have to open that up. And this idea of misframing, here the injustice arises when the community's boundaries are drawn in such a way as to wrongly exclude some people from the chance to participate. So the need to, is this enough? And that's where I'm going to leave us as you move through the article. And please see me anytime with any questions on this.